In October 1980, the new archbishop condemned the war of extermination and genocide against the civilian population waged by the security forces trained at Fort Benning, Georgia. 2 months later, they were hailed for their valiant service alongside the people against subversion by the favorite U.S. moderate, quote, moderate, Jose Napoleon Duarte, as he was appointed civilian president of the junta. The role of the, quote, moderate Duarte was to provide a fig leaf for the military rulers to ensure them a continuing flow of U.S. funding after the armed forces had raped and murdered 4 churchwomen from the U.S. That had aroused some protest here. Slaughtering Salvadorans is one thing, but raping and killing American nuns is a definite PR mistake. The media evaded and downplayed the story, following the lead of the Carter administration and its investigative commission. The incoming Reaganites went much further, seeking to justify the atrocity. Notably, Secretary of State Alexander Haig is here, and UN Ambassador Jeane Kirkpatrick. But it was still deemed worthwhile to have a show trial a few years later while exculpating the murderous junta and, of course, the paymaster. The independent newspapers in El Salvador, which might have reported these atrocities, had been destroyed. Although they were mainstream and pro-business, they were still too undisciplined for the military's taste. The problem was taken care of in 1980 and 81, when the editor of one was murdered by the security forces, the other fled into exile. As usual, these events were considered too insignificant to merit more than a few words in U.S. newspapers. In November 1989, 6 Jesuit priests with their cook and her daughter were murdered by the army that same week. At least 28 other Salvadoran civilians were murdered, including the head of a major union, the leader of the Organization of University Women, 9 members of an Indian farming cooperative, and 10 university students. The news wires carried a story by AP correspondent Douglas Grant Mine, reporting how soldiers had entered a working-class neighborhood in the capital city of San Salvador, captured 6 men, added a 14-year-old boy for good measure, then lined them all up against the wall and shot them. They were not priests or human rights campaigners, Mine wrote, so their deaths have gone largely unnoticed. As did his story. Fancy that. The Jesuits were murdered by the Atlacatal Battalion, an elite unit created, trained, and equipped by the United States. It was formed in March 1981 when 15 specialists in counterinsurgency were sent to El Salvador from the U.S. Army School of Special Forces. From the start, the battalion was engaged in mass murder. A U.S. trainer described its soldiers as particularly ferocious. We've always had a hard time getting them to take prisoners instead of ears. End quote. In December 1981, the battalion took part in an operation in which over 1,000 civilians were killed in an orgy of murder, rape, and burning. Later, it was involved in the bombing of villages and murder of hundreds of civilians by shooting, drowning, and other methods. The vast majority of victims were women, children, and the elderly. The Atlacatal Battalion was being trained by U.S. Special Forces shortly before murdering the Jesuits. This has been a pattern throughout the battalion's existence. Some of its worst massacres have occurred when it was fresh from U.S. training. In the fledgling democracy that was El Salvador, teenagers as young as 13 were scooped up in sweeps of slums and refugee camps and forced to become soldiers. They were indoctrinated with rituals adopted from the Nazi SS, including brutalization and rape, to prepare them for killings that often have sexual and satanic overtones. The nature of Salvadoran army training was described by a deserter who received political asylum in Texas in 1990, despite the State Department's request that he be sent back to El Salvador. His name was withheld by the court to protect him from Salvadoran death squads. According to this deserter, draftees were made to kill dogs and vultures by biting their throats and twisting off their heads, and had to watch soldiers tortured and killed suspected dissidents, tearing out their fingernails, cutting off their heads, chopping their bodies to pieces, and playing with the dismembered arms for fun. In another case, an admitted member of a Salvadoran death squad associated with the Atlacatal Battalion, Cesar Vielman Hoya Martinez, detailed the involvement of U.S. advisors in the Salvadoran government in death squad activity. The Bush administration has made every effort to silence him and ship him back to a probable death in El Salvador, despite the pleas of human rights organizations and requests from Congress that his testimony be heard. The treatment of the main witness to the assassination of the Jesuits was similar. The results of Salvadoran military training are graphically described in the Jesuit journal America by Daniel Santiago, a Catholic priest working in El Salvador. He tells of a peasant woman who returned home one day to find her 3 children, her mother and her sister, sitting around a table, each with his own decapitated head placed carefully on the table in front of the body, the hands arranged on top as if each body was stroking its own head. The assassins from the Salvadoran National Guard had found it hard to keep the head of an 18-month-old baby in place, so they nailed the hands onto it. A large plastic bowl filled with blood was tastefully displayed in the center of the table. According to Reverend Santiago, macabre scenes of this kind aren't uncommon. People are not just killed by death squads in El Salvador, they are decapitated and then their heads are placed on pikes and used to dot the landscape. Men are not just disemboweled by the Salvadoran Treasury Police, their severed genitalia are stuffed into their mouths. Salvadoran women are not just raped by the National Guard, their wombs are cut from their bodies and used to cover their faces. It is not enough to kill children, they are dragged over barbed wire until the flesh falls from their bones, while their parents are forced to watch. Reverend Santiago goes on to point out that violence of this sort greatly increased when the church began forming peasant associations and self-help groups in an attempt to organize the poor. By and large, our approach to El Salvador has been successful. The popular organizations have been decimated, just as Archbishop Romero predicted. Tens of thousands have been slaughtered, and more than 1 million have become refugees. This is one of the most sordid episodes in U.S. history, and it's got a lot of competition. Teaching Nicaragua a lesson. It wasn't just El Salvador that was ignored by the mainstream U.S. media during the 1970s. In the 10 years prior to the overthrow of the Nicaraguan dictator Anastasio Somoza in 1979, U.S. television, all networks devoted exactly 1 hour to Nicaragua, and that was entirely on the Managua earthquake of 1972. From 1960 through 1978, the New York Times had 3 editorials on Nicaragua. It's not that nothing was happening there, it's just that whatever was happening was unremarkable. Nicaragua was in no concern at all, as long as Somoza's tyrannical rule wasn't challenged. When his rule was challenged by the Sandinistas in the late 1970s, the U.S. first tried to institute what was called Somocismo, Somozaism without Somoza. That is, the whole corrupt system intact, but with somebody else at the top. That didn't work, so President Carter tried to maintain Somoza's National Guard as a base for U.S. power. The National Guard had always been remarkably brutal and sadistic. By 1979, it was carrying out massive atrocities in the war against the Sandinistas, bombing residential neighborhoods in Managua, killing tens of thousands of people. At that point, the U.S. ambassador sent a cable to the White House saying it would be ill-advised to tell the Guard to call off the bombing because what might interfere with the policy of keeping them in power, that might interfere with the policy of keeping them in power and the Sandinistas out. Our ambassador to the Organization of American States also spoke in favor of Somocismo without Somoza. But the OAS rejected the suggestion flat out. A few days later, Somoza flew off to Miami with what was left of the Nicaraguan National Treasury, and the Guard collapsed. The Carter administration flew Guard commanders out of the country in planes with Red Cross markings, a war crime, and began to reconstitute the Guard on Nicaragua's borders. They also used Argentina as a proxy. At that time, Argentina was under the rule of neo-Nazi generals, and they took a little time off from torturing and murdering their own population to help reestablish the Guard, soon to be renamed the Contras, or Freedom Fighters. Reagan used them to launch a large-scale terrorist war against Nicaragua, combined with economic warfare that was even more lethal. We also intimidated other countries so they wouldn't send aid either. And yet, despite astronomical levels of military support, the United States failed to create a viable military force in Nicaragua. That's quite remarkable if you think about it. For no real guerrillas anywhere in the world have ever had resources even remotely like what the United States gave the Contras. You could probably start a guerrilla insurgency in mountain regions of the U.S. with comparable funding. Why did the U.S. go to such lengths in Nicaragua? The International Development Organization, Oxfam, explained the real reasons, stating that from its experience of working in 76 developing countries, Nicaragua was exceptional in the strength of that government's commitment to improving the condition of the people and encouraging their active participation in the development process. Of the 4 Central American countries where Oxfam had significant presence, El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, and Nicaragua, only in Nicaragua was there a substantial effort to address inequities in land ownership and to extend health, educational, and agricultural services to poor peasant families. Think about it. Other agencies told a similar story. In the early 1980s, the World Bank called its projects extraordinarily successful in Nicaragua in some sectors, better than anywhere else in the world. In 1983, the Inter-American Development Bank concluded that Nicaragua has made noteworthy progress in the social sector, which is laying the basis for long-term socioeconomic development. The success of the Sandinista reforms terrified U.S. planners. They were aware that, as Jose Figueres, the father of the Costa Rican democracy, put it, for the first time, Nicaragua has a government that cares for its people. Although Figueres was the leading democratic figure in Central America for 40 years, his unacceptable insights into the real world were completely censored from the U.S. media. The hatred that was elicited by the Sandinistas for trying to direct resources to the poor and even succeeding at it was truly wondrous to behold. Just about all U.S. policymakers shared it, and it reached a virtual frenzy. Back in 1981, a State Department insider boasted that we would turn Nicaragua into the Albania of Central America, that is, poor, isolated, and politically radical, so that the Sandinista dream of creating a new, more exemplary political model for Latin America would be in ruins. George Schultz called the Sandinistas a cancer right here on our landmass, end quote, that has to be destroyed. At the other end of the political spectrum, leading Senate liberal Alan Cranston said that if it turned out not to be possible to destroy the Sandinistas, then we just have to let them fester in their own juices, unquote, end quote. So the U.S. launched a threefold attack against Nicaragua. First, we exerted extreme pressure to compel the World Bank and Inter-American Development Bank to terminate all projects and assistance. Second, we launched the Contra War along with illegal economic war to terminate what Oxfam rightly called the threat of a good example. The Contras' vicious terrorist attacks against soft targets under U.S. orders did help, along with the boycott, to end any hope of economic development and social reform. U.S. terror ensured that Nicaragua couldn't demobilize its army and divert its pitifully poor and limited resources to reconstructing the ruins that were left by the U.S.-backed dictators and Reaganite crimes. One of the most respected Central America correspondents, Julia Preston, who was then working for the Boston Globe, reported that, quote, administration officials said that they are content to see Contras debilitate the Sandinistas by forcing them to divert scarce resources toward the war and away from social programs, end quote. That's crucial, since the social programs were at the heart of the good example that might have infected other countries in the region and eroded the American system of exploitation and robbery. We even refused to send disaster relief. After the 1972 earthquake, the U.S. sent an enormous amount of aid to Nicaragua, most of which was stolen by our buddy Somoza. In October 1988, an even worse natural disaster struck Nicaragua, Hurricane Joan. We didn't send a penny for that, because if we had, it would probably have gotten to the people, not just into the pockets of some rich thug. We also pressured our allies to send very little aid. This devastating hurricane, with its welcome prospects of mass starvation and long-term ecological damage, reinforced our efforts. We wanted Nicaraguans to starve so we could accuse the Sandinistas of economic mismanagement, because they weren't under our control. Nicaraguans had to suffer and die. Third, we used diplomatic fakery to crush Nicaragua. As Tony Avergan wrote in the Costa Rican journal Mesoamerica, the Sandinistas fell for a scam perpetrated by Costa Rican President Oscar Arias and the other Central American presidents, which cost them the February elections. For Nicaragua, the peace plan of August 1987 was a good deal. Avergan wrote they would move the scheduled national elections forward by a few months and allow international observation, as they had in 1984, quote, in exchange for having the Contras demobilized and the war brought to an end, end quote. The Nicaraguan government did what it was required to do under the peace plan, but no one else paid the slightest attention to it. Arias, the White House, and Congress never had the slightest intention of implementing any aspect of the plan. The U.S. virtually tripled CIA supply flights to the Contras. Within a couple of months, the peace plan was totally dead. As the election campaign opened, the U.S. made it clear that the embargo that was strangling the country and Contra-terror would continue if the Sandinistas won the election. You have to be some kind of Nazi or unreconstructed Stalinist to regard an election conducted under such conditions as free and fair, and south of the border. Few succumb to such delusions. Okay. If anything like that were ever done by our enemies, I leave the media reaction to your imagination. The amazing part of it was that the Sandinistas still got 40% of the vote, while New York Times headlines proclaimed Americans were united in joy over this victory for U.S. fair play, end quote. U.S. achievements in Central America in the past 15 years are a major tragedy, not just because of the appalling human cost, but because a decade ago there were prospects for real progress towards meaningful democracy and meeting human needs, with early successes in El Salvador, Guatemala, and Nicaragua. These efforts might have worked and might have taught useful lessons to others plagued with similar problems, which of course was exactly what U.S. planners feared. The threat has been successfully aborted, perhaps forever. Making Guatemala a killing field. There was one place in Central America that did get some U.S. media coverage before the Sandinista Revolution, and that was Guatemala. In 1944, a revolution there overthrew a vicious tyrant, leading to the establishment of a democratic government that basically modeled itself on Roosevelt's New Deal. In the 10-year democratic interlude that followed, there were the beginnings of successful independent economic development. That caused virtual hysteria in Washington. Eisenhower and Dulles warned that the self-defense and self-preservation of the United States was at stake unless the virus was exterminated. U.S. intelligence reports were very candid about the dangers posed by capitalist democracy in Guatemala. A CIA memorandum of 1952 described the situation in Guatemala as, quote, adverse to U.S. interest, end quote, because of the, quote, communist influence based on militant advocacy of social reforms and nationalistic policies, end quote. The memo warned that Guatemala, quote, has recently stepped up substantially its support of communist and anti-American activities in other Central American countries, end quote. One prime example cited was an alleged gift of $300,000 to Jose Figueres. As mentioned above, Jose Figueres was the founder of Costa Rican democracy and a leading democratic figure in Central America. Although he cooperated enthusiastically with the CIA and had called the United States the standard bearer of our cause and was regarded by the U.S. ambassador to Costa Rica as the, quote, best advertising agency that the United Fruit Company could find in Latin America, end quote, Figueres had an independent streak and was therefore not considered as reliable as Somoza or other gangsters in our employ. In the political rhetoric of the United States, this made him possibly a, quote, communist, end quote. So if Guatemala gave him money to help him win an election, that showed Guatemala supported communists. Worse yet, the same CIA memorandum continued the, quote, radical and nationalist policies, end quote, of the democratic capitalist government, including the, quote, persecution of foreign economic interests, especially the United Fruit Company. They're persecuting our fruit company, end quote. Had gained the, quote, support or acquiescence of almost all Guatemalans. The government was proceeding to mobilize the hitherto politically inert peasantry while undermining the power of large landholders. Furthermore, the 1944 revolution had aroused A strong national movement to free Guatemala from the military dictatorship, social backwardness, and economic colonialism, which had been the pattern of the past, and inspired the loyalty and conformed to the self-interest of the most politically conscious Guatemalans. Things became still worse after a successful land reform began to threaten stability in neighboring countries where suffering people did not fail to take notice. In short, the situation was pretty awful, so the CIA carried out a successful coup. Guatemala was turned into the slaughterhouse it remains today, with regular U.S. intervention whenever things threatened to get out of line. By the late 1970s, atrocities were again mounting beyond the terrible norm, eliciting verbal protests, and yet, contrary to what many people believe, military aid to Guatemala continued at virtually the same level under the Carter Human Rights Administration. Our allies have been enlisted in the cause as well, notably Israel, which is regarded as a strategic asset, in part because of its success in guiding state terrorism. Under Reagan, support for near genocide in Guatemala became positively ecstatic. The most extreme of the Guatemalan Hitlers we backed there, Rios Montt, was lauded by Reagan as a man totally dedicated to democracy. In the early 1980s, Washington's friends slaughtered tens of thousands of Guatemalans, mostly Indians in the highlands, with countless others tortured and raped. Large regions were decimated. In 1988, a newly opened Guatemalan newspaper called La Época was blown up by government terrorists. At the same time, the media here were very much exercised over the fact that the U.S.-funded journal in Nicaragua, La Prensa, which was openly calling for the overthrow of the government and supporting the U.S.-run terrorist army, had been forced to miss a couple of issues due to a shortage of newsprint. That led to a torrent of outrage and abuse in the Washington Post and elsewhere about Sandinista totalitarianism. On the other hand, the destruction of La Época aroused no interest whatsoever and was not reported here. Although it was well known to U.S. journalists, naturally the U.S. media couldn't be expected to notice that U.S.-funded security forces had silenced the one tiny independent voice that had tried a few weeks earlier to speak up in Guatemala. A year later, a journalist from La Época, Julio Godoy, had fled after the bombing, went back to Guatemala for a brief visit. When he returned to the U.S., he contrasted the situation in Central America with that in Eastern Europe. Eastern Europeans are luckier than Central Americans, Godoy wrote, because while the Moscow-imposed government in Prague would degrade and humiliate reformers, the Washington-made government in Guatemala would kill them. It still does, in a virtual genocide that has taken more than 150,000 victims in what Amnesty International calls a government program of political murder. The press either conforms or, as in the case of La Época, disappears. One is tempted to believe, Godoy continued, that some people in the White House worship Aztec gods with the offering of Central American blood. And he quoted a Western European diplomat who said, "As long as the Americans don't change their attitude towards the region, there's no space here for truth or for hope." The invasion of Panama. Panama has been traditionally controlled by its tiny European elite, less than 10% of the population. That changed in 1968 when Omar Torrijos, a populist general, led a coup that allowed the black and mestizo mixed-race poor to obtain at least a share of the power under his military dictatorship. In 1981, Torrijos was killed in a plane crash. By 1983, the effective ruler was Manuel Noriega, a criminal who had been a cohort of Torrijos in U.S. intelligence. The U.S. government knew that Noriega was involved in drug trafficking since at least 1972, when the Nixon administration considered assassinating him. But he stayed on the CIA payroll. In 1983, a U.S. Senate committee concluded that Panama was a major center for the laundering of drug funds and drug trafficking. The U.S. government continued to value Noriega's services. In May 1986, the director of the Drug Enforcement Agency praised Noriega for his vigorous anti-drug trafficking policy, yada, yada, yada. A year later, the director welcomed our close association with Noriega, while Attorney General Edwin Meese stopped a U.S. Justice Department investigation of Noriega's criminal activities. In August 1987, a Senate resolution condemning Noriega was opposed by Elliott Abrams, the State Department official in charge of U.S. policy in Central America and Panama. And yet, when Noriega was finally indicted in Miami in 1988, all the charges except one were related to activities that took place before 1984, back when he was our boy, helping with the U.S. war against Nicaragua, stealing elections with U.S. approval, and generally serving U.S. interest satisfactorily. It had nothing to do with suddenly discovering that he was a gangster and a drug peddler. That was known all along. It's all quite predictable. As study after study shows, a brutal tyrant crosses the line from admirable friend to villain and scum when he commits the crime of independence. One common mistake is to go beyond robbing the poor, which is just fine, and to start interfering with the privileged, eliciting opposition from business leaders. By the mid-1980s, Noriega was guilty of these crimes. Among other things, he seems to have been dragging his feet about helping the U.S. in the Contra War. His independence also threatened our interests in the Panama Canal. On January 1st, 1990, most of the administration of the canal was due to go over to Panama. In the year 2000, it goes completely to them. We had to make sure Panama was in the hands of people we could control before that date. Since we could no longer trust Noriega to do our bidding, he had to go. Washington imposed economic sanctions that virtually destroyed the economy, the main burden falling on the poor, non-white majority. They, too, came to hate Noriega, not just because he was responsible for the economic warfare, which was illegal, if anyone cares, that was causing children to starve. Not least because he was responsible. Next, a military coup was tried but failed. Then, in December 1989, the U.S. celebrated the fall of the Berlin Wall and the end of the Cold War by invading Panama outright, killing hundreds or perhaps thousands of civilians. No one knows, and few north of the Rio Grande care enough to inquire. This restored to power the rich white elite that had been replaced by the Torrijos coup, just in time to ensure a compliant government for the administrative changeover of the canal on January 1st, 1990, as noted by the right-wing European press. Throughout this process, the press followed Washington's lead, Washington's lead, selecting villains in terms of current needs. Actions we'd formerly condoned became crimes. For example, in 1984, Panamanian presidential election had been won by Arnulfo Arias. The election was stolen by Noriega with considerable violence and fraud. But Noriega hadn't yet become disobedient. He was our man in Panama, and the Arias party was considered to have dangerous elements of ultranationalism. The Reagan administration, therefore, applauded the violence and fraud and sent Secretary of State George Shultz down to legitimate the stolen election and praise Noriega's version of, quote, democracy, end quote, as a model for the errant Sandinistas. The Washington Media Alliance and the major journals refrained from criticizing the fraudulent elections, but dismissed as utterly worthless the Sandinistas' far more free and honest election in the same year because it could not be controlled. In May 1989, Noriega again stole an election, this time from a representative of the business opposition, Guillermo Endara. Noriega used less violence than in 1984, but the Reagan administration had given the signal it had turned against Noriega. Following the predictable script, the press expressed outrage over his failure to meet our lofty democratic standards. The press also began to passionately denouncing human rights violations. Oh, look at the human rights violations that previously didn't reach the threshold of their attention. By the time we invaded Panama in December 1989, the press had demonized Noriega, turning him into the worst monster since Attila the Hun. It was basically a replay of the demonization of Gaddafi of Libya. Ted Koppel was orating that Noriega belongs to that special fraternity of international villains, men like Gaddafi, Idi Amin, and the Ayatollah Khomeini, whom Americans just love to hate, end quote. Dan Rather placed him at the top of the list of the world's drug thieves and scums, end quote. And in fact, Noriega remained a very minor thug, exactly what he was when he was on the CIA payroll. In 1988, for example, America's Watch published a report on human rights in Panama, giving an unpleasant picture. But as their reports and other inquiries make clear, Noriega's human rights record was nothing remotely like that of other U.S. clients in the region, and no worse than in the days when Noriega was still a favorite, following orders. Take Honduras, for example. Although it's not a murderous terrorist state like El Salvador or Guatemala, human rights abuses were probably worse there than in Panama. In fact, there's one CIA-trained battalion in Honduras that all by itself had carried out more atrocities than Noriega did. Or consider U.S.-backed dictators like Trujillo in the Dominican Republic, Somoza in Nicaragua, Marcos in the Philippines, Duvalier in Haiti, and a host of Central American gangsters through the 1980s. They were all much more brutal than Noriega, but the United States supported them enthusiastically right through the decades of horrifying atrocities, as long as the profits were flowing out of their countries and into the U.S. George Bush's administration continued to honor Mobutu, Ceausescu, and Saddam Hussein, for that matter, among others, all far worse criminals than Noriega. Suharto of Indonesia, arguably the worst killer of them all, remains a Washington media moderate. In fact, at exactly the moment it invaded Panama because of its outrage over Noriega's abuses of human rights, the Bush administration announced a new high technology sales to China, noting that $300 million in business for U.S. firms was at stake and that contacts had secretly resumed a few weeks after the Tiananmen Square massacre. On the same day, Panama was invaded. The White House also announced plans and implemented it shortly afterward to lift the ban on loans to Iraq. The State Department explained with a straight face that this was to achieve the goal of increasing U.S. exports and put us in a better position to deal with Iraq regarding its human rights record. The department continued with the pose as Bush rebuffed the Iraqi Democratic opposition, bankers, professionals, etc., and blocked congressional efforts to condemn the atrocious crimes of his old friend Saddam Hussein. Compared to Bush's buddies in Baghdad and Beijing, Noriega looked like Mother Teresa. After the invasion, Bush announced $1 billion in aid to Panama. Of this, $400 million consisted of incentives for U.S. business to export products to Panama. $150 million was to pay off bank loans, and $65 million went to private sector loans and guarantees to U.S. investors. In other words, about half the aid was a gift from the American taxpayer to American businesses. The U.S. put the bankers back in power after the invasion. Noriega's involvement in drug trafficking had been trivial compared to theirs. Drug trafficking there has always been conducted primarily by the banks. The banking system is virtually unregulated, so it's a natural outlet for criminal money. This has been the basis for Panama's highly artificial economy and remains so, possibly at a higher level after the invasion. The Panamanian Defense Forces have also been reconstructed with basically the same officers. In general, everything's pretty much the same, only now more reliable servants are in charge. The same is true of Grenada, which has become a major center of drug money laundering since the U.S. invasion. Nicaragua, too, has become a significant conduit for drugs into the U.S. market. After Washington's victory in the 1990 election, the pattern is standard, as is the failure to notice it. Inoculating Southeast Asia. The U.S. wars in Indochina fall into the same general pattern. By 1948, the State Department recognized quite clearly that the Viet Minh, the anti-French resistance led by Ho Chi Minh, was the national movement in Vietnam. But the Viet Minh did not cede control to the local oligarchy. It favored independent development and ignored the interests of foreign investors. There was fear the Viet Minh might succeed, in which case the rot would spread and the virus would infect the region. To adopt the language that the planners use year after year after year, except for a few madmen and nitwits, none feared conquest. They were afraid of a positive example of successful development. What do you do when you have a virus? First you destroy it, then you inoculate potential victims so that the disease does not spread. That's basically the U.S. strategy in the Third World. If possible, it's advisable to have the local military destroy the virus for you. If they can't, you have to move your own forces in. That's more costly and it's ugly, but sometimes you have to do it. Vietnam was one of those places where we had to do it. Right into the late 1960s, the U.S. blocked all attempts at political settlement of the conflict, even those advanced by the Saigon generals. If there were a political settlement, there might be progress towards successful development outside our influence, an unacceptable outcome. Instead, we installed a typical Latin American-style terror state in South Vietnam, subverted the only free elections in the history of Laos because the wrong side won, and blocked elections in Vietnam because it was obvious the wrong side was going to win there too. The Kennedy administration escalated the attack against South Vietnam from massive state terror to outright aggression. Johnson sent a huge expeditionary force to attack South Vietnam and expanded the war to all of Indochina. That destroyed the virus, all right. Indochina will be lucky if it recovers in 100 years. While the United States was extirpating the disease of independent development at its source in Vietnam, it also prevented its spread by supporting the Suharto takeover in Indonesia in 1965, backing the overthrow of Philippine democracy by Ferdinand Marcos in 1972, supporting martial law in South Korea and Thailand, and so on. Suharto's 1965 coup in Indonesia was particularly welcome to the West because it destroyed the only mass-based political party there. That involved the slaughter in a few months of about 700,000 people, mostly landless peasants. A gleam of light in Asia, as the leading thinker of the New York Times, James Rustin, exulted, assuring his readers that the U.S. had a hand in this triumph. The West was very pleased to do business with Indonesia's new moderate leader, as the Christian Science Monitor described General Suharto, after he had washed some of the blood off of his hands. Meanwhile, adding hundreds of thousands of corpses in East Timor and elsewhere, the spectacular mass murderer is at the heart benign. At heart, he's benign. The respected London economist assures us, doubtless referring to his attitude towards Western corporations. After the Vietnam War was entered in 1975, the major policy goal of the U.S. has been to maximize repression and suffering in the countries that were devastated by our violence. The degree of the cruelty is quite astonishing. When the Mennonites tried to send pencils to Cambodia, the State Department tried to stop them. When Oxfam tried to send 10 solar pumps, the reaction was the same. The same was true when religious groups tried to send shovels to Laos to dig up some of the unexploded shells left by American bombing. When India tried to send 100 water buffalo to Vietnam to replace the huge herds that were destroyed by the American attacks, and remember, in this primitive country, water buffalo mean fertilizer, tractor, survival, the United States threatened to cancel food and peace aid. That's one Orwell would have appreciated. No degree of cruelty is too great for Washington sadists. The educated classes know enough to look the other way. In order to bleed Vietnam, we've supported the Khmer Rouge indirectly through our allies, China and Thailand. The Cambodians have to pay with their blood so we can make sure there isn't any recovery in Vietnam. The Vietnamese have to be punished for having resisted U.S. violence. Contrary to what virtually everyone, left to right, says, the United States achieved its major objectives in Indochina. Vietnam was demolished. There's no danger that successful development there will provide a model for other nations in the region. Of course, it wasn't a total victory for the U.S. Our larger goal was to reincorporate Indochina into the U.S.-dominated global system, and that has not yet been achieved. But our basic goal, the crucial one, the one that really counted, was to destroy the virus, and we did achieve that. Vietnam is a basket case, and the U.S. is doing what it can to keep it that way. In October 1991, the U.S. once again overrode the strenuous objections of its allies in Europe and Japan and renewed the embargo and sanctions against Vietnam. The Third World must learn that no one dares to raise their head. The global enforcer will persecute them relentlessly if they commit this unspeakable crime. The Gulf War. The Gulf War illustrated the same guiding principles as we see clearly if we lift the veil of propaganda. When Iraq invaded Kuwait in August 1990, the UN Security Council immediately condemned Iraq and imposed severe sanctions on it. Why was the UN response so prompt and unprecedentedly firm? The U.S. government media alliance had a standard answer. First, it told us that Iraq's aggression was a unique crime and thus merited a uniquely harsh reaction. America stands where it always has against aggression, against those who would use force to replace the rule of law, and so we were informed by President Bush the invader of Panama and the only head of state condemned by the World Court for the unlawful use of force. In the court's condemnation of the U.S. attack against Nicaragua, the media and the educated classes dutifully repeated the lines spelled out for them by their leader, collapsing in awe at the magnificence of his high principles. Second, the same authorities proclaimed in a litany that the UN was now, at last, functioning as it was designed to do. They claimed that this was impossible before the end of the Cold War, when the UN was rendered ineffective by Soviet disruption and the shrill anti-Western rhetoric of the Third World. Neither of these claims can withstand even a moment's scrutiny. The U.S. wasn't upholding any high principle in the Gulf, nor was any other state. The reason for the unprecedented response to Saddam Hussein wasn't his brutal aggression. It was because he stepped on the wrong toes. Saddam Hussein is a murderous gangster, exactly as he was before the Gulf War, when he was our friend and favored trading partner. His invasion of Kuwait was certainly an atrocity, but well within the range of many similar crimes conducted by the U.S. and its allies, and nowhere near as terrible as some, for example, Indonesia's invasion and annexation of East Timor reached near genocidal proportions thanks to the decisive support of the United States and its allies. Perhaps 1/4 of the 700,000 population were killed, slaughtered, a slaughter exceeding that of Pol Pot relative to the population in the same years. Our ambassador to the UN at the time, and now Senator from New York, Daniel Moynihan, explained his achievement at the UN concerning East Timor. Quote, "The United States wished things to turn out as they did and worked to bring this about. The Department of State desired that the United Nations prove utterly ineffective. In whatever measures it undertook, this task was given to me, and I carried it forward with no inconsiderable success," end quote. The Australian Foreign Minister justified his country's acquiescence to the invasion and annexation of East Timor and Australia's participation with Indonesia in robbing Timor's rich oil reserves by saying simply that the world is a pretty unfair place, littered with examples of acquisition by force, end quote. When Iraq invaded Kuwait, however, his government issued a ringing declaration that big countries cannot invade small neighbors and get away with it. No heights of cynicism trouble the equanimity of Western moralists. As for the UN functioning as it was designed to do, the facts are clear, but obviously barred by the guardians of political correctness who control the means of expression with an iron hand. For many years, the UN has been blocked by the great powers, primarily the United States, not the Soviet Union or the Third World. Since 1970, the United States has vetoed far more Security Council resolutions than any other country. Britain is second, France a distant third, and the Soviet Union fourth. Our record in the General Assembly is similar, and the shrill anti-Western rhetoric of the Third World commonly turns out to be a call to observe international law, a pitifully weak barrier against the depredations of the powerful. The UN was able to respond to Iraq's aggression because, for once, the United States allowed it to. The unprecedented severity of the UN sanctions was the result of intense U.S. pressure and threats. The sanctions had an unusually good chance of working, both because of their harshness and because the usual sanctions busters, the United States, Britain, and France, would have abided by them for a change. But even after allowing sanctions, the U.S. immediately moved to close off the diplomatic option by dispatching a huge military force to the Gulf, joined by Britain and backed by the family dictatorships that rule the Gulf's oil states, with only nominal participation by others. A smaller deterrent force could have been kept in place long enough for sanctions to have had a significant effect. An army of 500,000 couldn't. The purpose of the quick military buildup was to ward off the danger that Iraq might be forced out of Kuwait by peaceful means. Why was a diplomatic resolution so unattractive? Within a few weeks after the invasion of Kuwait, on August 2nd, the basic outlines for a possible political settlement were becoming clear. Security Council Resolution 660, calling for Iraq's withdrawal from Kuwait, also called for simultaneous negotiations of border issues. By mid-August, the National Security Council considered an Iraqi proposal to withdraw from Kuwait in that context. There appear to have been two issues. First, Iraqi access to the Gulf, which would have entailed a lease or other control over two uninhabited mud flats assigned to Kuwait by Britain in its imperial settlement, which had left Iraq virtually landlocked. Second, resolution of a dispute over an oil field that extended 2 miles into Kuwait over an unsettled border. Rumalia, I think that's called. The U.S. flatly rejected the proposal or any negotiations. On August 22nd, without revealing these facts about the Iraqi initiative, which it apparently knew, the New York Times reported that the Bush administration was determined to block the diplomatic track for fear that it might diffuse the crisis in very much this manner. The basic facts were published a week later by the Long Island Daily Newsday, but the media largely kept their silence. The last known offer before the bombing, released by U.S. officials on January 2, 1991, called for a total Iraqi withdrawal from Kuwait. There were no qualifications about borders, but the offer was made in the context of unspecified agreements on other linked issues, weapons of mass destruction in the region and the Israel-Arab conflict. Arab-Israeli conflict. The latter issues include Israel's illegal occupation of southern Lebanon in violation of Security Council Resolution 425 of March 1978, which called for its immediate and unconditional withdrawal from the territory it had invaded. The U.S. response was that there would be no diplomacy. The media suppressed the facts, Newsday aside, while lauding Bush's high principles. That's what we got here is principles. Yeah. The U.S. refused to consider the linked issues because it was opposed to diplomacy on all the linked issues. This had been made clear months before Iraq's invasion of Kuwait, when the U.S. had rejected Iraq's offer of negotiations over weapons of mass destruction. In the offer, Iraq proposed to destroy all such chemical and biological weapons if other countries in the region also destroyed their weapons of mass destruction. That's outrageous. How could they expect that? Okay. Saddam Hussein was then Bush's friend and ally, so he received a response, which was instructive. Washington said it welcomed Iraq's proposal to destroy its own weapons, but didn't want this linked to other issues or weapon systems. There was no mention of the other weapon systems, and there's a reason for that. Israel not only may have chemical and biological weapons, is also the only country in the Middle East and the Mideast with nuclear weapons, probably about 200 of them. But Israeli nuclear weapons is a phrase that can't be written or uttered by any official U.S. government source. That phrase would raise the question of why all aid to Israel is not illegal, since foreign aid legislation from 1977 bars funds to any country that secretly develops nuclear weapons. Think about it. Independent of Iraq's invasion, the U.S. had also always blocked any, quote, peace process in the Middle East that included an international conference in recognition of a Palestinian right to self-determination. For 20 years, the U.S. has been virtually alone in this stance. UN votes indicate that the regular annual pattern, once again in December 1990, right in the midst of the Gulf crisis, the call for an international conference was voted 144-2, U.S. and Israel. This had nothing to do with Iraq and Kuwait. The U.S. also adamantly refused to allow a reversal of Iraq's aggression by the peaceful means prescribed by international law. Instead, it preferred to avoid diplomacy and to restrict the conflict to the arena of violence, in which a superpower facing no deterrent is bound to prevail over a third world adversary. As already discussed, the U.S. regularly carries out or supports aggression, even in cases far more criminal than Iraq's invasion of Kuwait. Only the most dedicated commissar can fail to understand these facts, or the fact that in the rare case when the U.S. happens to oppose some illegal act by a client or ally, it's quite happy with linkage. Take the South African occupation of Namibia. Declared illegal by the World Court in the UN in the 1960s, the United States pursued quiet diplomacy and constructive engagement for years, brokering a settlement that gave South Africa ample reward, including Namibia's major port, for its aggression and atrocities, with linkage extending to the Caribbean and welcome benefits for international business interests. The Cuban forces that had defended Namibia's neighbor Angola from South African attack were withdrawn, Much as in Nicaragua after the 1987, quote, peace accords, the United States continued to support the terrorist army backed by the U.S. and its allies, South Africa and Zaire, and is preparing the ground for a 1992 Nicaragua-style democratic election where people will go to the polls under threat of economic strangulation and terrorist attack if they vote the wrong way. Meanwhile, South Africa was looting and destroying Namibia and using it as a base for violence against its neighbors. In the Reagan-Bush years, 1980 to 1988 alone, South African violence led to about $60 billion in damage and over 1.5 million people killed in the neighboring countries. Excluding Namibia and South Africa, for that matter. Okay, but the Commissar class was unable to see these facts and hail George Bush's amazing display of principle as he opposed linkage when someone steps on our toes. More generally, opposing linkage amounts to little more than rejecting diplomacy, which always involves broader issues. In the case of Kuwait, the U.S. position was particularly flimsy. After Saddam Hussein stepped out of line, the Bush administration insisted Iraq's capacity for aggression be eliminated, a correct position in contrast to its earlier support for Saddam's aggression and atrocities, and called for regional settlement guaranteeing security. Well, that's linkage. The simple fact that the U.S. feared that diplomacy might defuse the crisis and therefore block diplomacy linkage at every turn during the build-up to the war. By refusing diplomacy, the U.S. achieved its major goals in the Gulf. We were concerned that the incomparable energy resources of the Middle East remain under our control and that the enormous profits they produce help support the economies of the U.S. and its British client. The U.S. also reinforced its dominant position and taught the lesson that the world is to be ruled by force. These goals having been achieved, Washington proceeded to maintain stability, barring any threat of democratic change in the Gulf tyrannies, and lending tacit support to Saddam Hussein as he crushed the popular uprising of the Shiites in the south, a few miles from U.S. lines, and then the Kurds in the north. But the Bush administration has not yet succeeded in achieving what its spokesman at the New York Times, the chief diplomatic correspondent Thomas Friedman, calls the best of all worlds, an iron-fisted Iraqi junta without Saddam Hussein. Saddam without Saddam. This, Friedman writes, would be a return to the happy days when Saddam's iron fist held Iraq together, much to the satisfaction of the American allies, Turkey and Saudi Arabia, not to speak of the boss in Washington. The current situation in the Gulf reflects the priorities of the superpower that held all the cards, another truism that must remain invisible to the guardians of the faith.